Picture this, a kid so small he could barely see over the dashboard, asleep in the back of a van his father drove for hours, just to get him to a football trial. No money for gas the next week. No guarantee any of this would work. Just a father's faith and a boy's feet that moved like they were born, knowing something the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. That boy would grow up to become the most expensive footballer in the history of the sport. A €222 million price tag. A number so big it broke the transfer market and rewrote the rules of what a human being could be worth on a football pitch. But here's the thing, nobody tells you in the highlight reels. Before the money, before the fame, before the tattoos and the yachts and the world stage, there was a family living paycheck to paycheck in a small Brazilian city, praying that talent would be enough to escape poverty. This is the story of Neymar. Not just the flashy stepovers and the World Cup heartbreak. The real story. The one with scars in it. Let's go back. February 5th, 1992. Mogi das Cruzes, a modest city outside Sao Paulo, Brazil. A baby boy is born to Neymar da Silva Santos Sr. and Nadine Gonçalves. They name him after his father, Neymar da Silva Santos Jr. Nobody in that hospital room could have known they were holding the future face of Brazilian football. Neymar Sr. wasn't just any dad. He'd been a footballer himself, grinding through lower division clubs, never quite breaking through to stardom. And when that dream didn't pan out the way he hoped, he did something remarkable. He poured everything he had left into his son's future instead. Not in a pushy, living vicariously kind of way. In a hands-on, disciplined, I know exactly what this sport demands kind of way. The family didn't have much. For a stretch of Neymar's childhood, money was so tight they lived in a single room attached to a gas station where his father worked as a mechanic. Think about that for a second. The greatest, most expensive footballer on the planet spent part of his early childhood sleeping in a converted storage space next to gasoline pumps. That's not a rags to riches cliché. That's just what happened. But inside that cramped little life, there was one constant. A ball at his feet. Neymar's father saw it early. The boy had something different. Quick feet, an almost arrogant sense of balance, and a joy for the game that looked less like training and more like play, even when it was deadly serious. Neymar Sr. became his son's fiercest advocate and, eventually, his agent, a decision that would follow Neymar into some of the biggest controversies of his career. But back then, it was simply survival. It was a father trying to give his son a way out. By age 7, Neymar was already playing futsal. That fast, tight, small-sided version of football played in gyms and tiny courts across Brazil. And here's something a lot of people don't realize. Futsal is basically why Neymar dribbles the way he does. In a cramped space with defenders closing in from every angle, you learn to think in fractions of a second. You learn tricks not to show off, but to survive. Everything people would later call flashy or unnecessary, that Samba flair, those impossible touches, it wasn't decoration. It was born out of necessity, out of a kid learning to escape pressure in a 4-meter box. The family moved to São Vicente, a coastal town near Santos, chasing better opportunities. And it was there that a local club noticed the kid everyone was talking about. Neymar joined the youth ranks of Santos Futebol Clube. Yes, the same legendary club that once belonged to a man named Pelé. Let that sink in for a second, because it's not just a nice detail, it's foreshadowing. At Santos, Neymar rose through the academy at a pace that made coaches do a double take. But talent alone doesn't guarantee anything. And this is where the story gets tense. As a young teenager, Neymar was actually offered a move to Real Madrid. One of the biggest clubs on earth wanted him before he'd even played a single senior match. Imagine that kind of pressure landing on a 15-year-old's shoulders. Santos, desperate not to lose their prodigy, fought to keep him, and ultimately, the family chose to stay in Brazil so Neymar could develop at his own pace, close to home, close to his roots. It's a decision that, looking back, shaped everything. Because Neymar didn't just develop as a player in those next few years. He became a phenomenon. March 2009, 17 years old, Neymar makes his professional debut for Santos. And almost instantly, something clicked that even the most experienced scouts couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a promising kid. This was must-watch television. Fans started showing up specifically to see him. Highlight compilations of a teenager went viral before going viral was even a phrase people used casually. By 2010, still a teenager, he was already being talked about as the heir to Brazil's golden generation. But let's pause here, because this is important. Neymar's rise wasn't some fairy tale straight line. There were real obstacles. Brazilian football culture can be brutal on young stars. Every mistake gets magnified. Every night out gets photographed. And Neymar, still a teenager thrust into a spotlight most adults couldn't handle, had to learn in public. He faced criticism for being more interested in tricks than substance. Rival fans mocked his hair, his flair, his perceived arrogance. For a kid still figuring out who he was, that kind of scrutiny could have broken him. It didn't. Instead, in 2011, Neymar delivered the moment that turned him from promising young Brazilian into a genuine global phenomenon. Santos, with a 19-year-old Neymar leading the line, won the Copa Libertadores, South America's version of the Champions League, for the first time in 48 years. Santos hadn't lifted that trophy since the days of Pelé himself, and now here was this new kid, carrying the ghost of Brazilian football's greatest legend on his back, delivering a title that older, more experienced legends couldn't. The comparisons to Pelé stopped being lazy journalism and started feeling almost prophetic. That same year, and again in 2012, Neymar was named South American Footballer of the Year. He was becoming, undeniably, the best player outside of Europe. And the whispers grew louder. When is he leaving? Which European giant gets him? The answer came in 2013, and it came with one of the messiest, most controversial transfers in football history. A controversy that would trail Neymar for years. FC Barcelona announced they had signed Neymar. The initial figure released to the public was just over 57 million euros. But almost immediately, cracks started showing in that story. Spanish authorities launched an investigation into the true cost of the deal, alleging that the real transfer fee, paid through a tangled web of payments involving Neymar's father, Santos, Barcelona, and third-party investment groups, was significantly higher than what had been disclosed, and that some of it may have involved tax fraud. Neymar and his father were formally investigated. Barcelona's president at the time was forced to resign amid the fallout. It became a genuine scandal. Front-page news, not just sports section stuff. For a kid barely out of his teens, this wasn't the triumphant European arrival he'd dreamed of. It was chaos, lawyers, and his father's name dragged through headlines. Eventually, years later, Neymar and his father reached a settlement in the case, without a conviction. But the damage to his image, the narrative that money and manipulation followed wherever Neymar went, that stuck around far longer than any court case. And yet, on the pitch, something extraordinary was forming. At Barcelona, Neymar joined a front three that would become one of the most feared attacking trios the sport has ever seen. Messi, Suarez, Neymar. The media nicknamed them MSN. In the 2014-15 season alone, that trio combined for over 120 goals. Neymar wasn't playing in Messi's shadow the way some predicted. He was thriving alongside him. In June 2015, Barcelona won the Champions League, defeating Juventus in the final, with Neymar scoring in that very match. He'd gone from a scandal-plagued signing to a Champions League winner in under 2 years. But football, like life, doesn't let you stay at the top without testing you first. The FIFA World Cup, hosted in Neymar's own country, Brazil. The pressure on him wasn't just about football. It was about national identity. A whole nation, desperate to heal decades of heartbreak, was leaning on this one young man's shoulders. And then, in the quarterfinal against Colombia, disaster struck. A brutal challenge left Neymar with a fractured vertebra. He was stretchered off the pitch in tears, his tournament over, and with it, arguably Brazil's realistic hopes of winning it all on home soil. What happened next became one of the most painful nights in Brazilian football history. Without Neymar, Brazil collapsed 7-1 to Germany in the semi-final, a defeat so catastrophic it's simply known in Brazil as the Mineirazo. Neymar watched it from the stands, in a neck brace, unable to do anything but witness his country's humiliation. Try to imagine that. Being the symbol of hope for an entire nation, and then being forced to watch helplessly as everything collapses without you. That kind of pain doesn't just disappear, it follows you. 2 years later, Neymar got his chance at redemption, not on the World Cup stage, but at the Olympics, which Brazil was also hosting, in Rio de Janeiro, 2016. Brazil had never won Olympic gold in men's football, not once. And the final came down to a rematch against the very team that had humiliated them in 2014, Germany. The match went to penalties, and it was Neymar, captain, star, the man carrying the weight of that 7-1 nightmare, who stepped up to take the final, decisive kick. He scored. Brazil won gold for the first time ever. Neymar dropped to his knees and sobbed on the pitch. It wasn't just a trophy, it was closure. It was a wound from 2 years earlier, finally, publicly, healed. If the story ended there, it would already be remarkable. But 2017 is when Neymar's career took its most jaw-dropping turn. Paris Saint-Germain, backed by Qatari ownership and enormous financial resources, activated Neymar's release clause at Barcelona. The number? 222 million euros. To put that in perspective, the previous world record transfer fee was less than half that amount. Neymar didn't just break the record. He shattered it so thoroughly that, years later, no transfer has come close to matching it. He became, and remains, the most expensive footballer in the history of the sport. But here's the part that surprises people. That fee became a kind of curse as much as a crown. The expectations that came with a price tag like that were almost impossible to satisfy. Every injury became a headline. Every missed tackle became a referendum on whether he was worth it. And unfortunately, injuries became a recurring theme of his PSG years. Foot fractures, ankle surgeries, hamstring issues. A player built on explosive dribbling and improvisation kept getting betrayed by his own body. Despite the injuries, the individual brilliance never fully disappeared. Neymar helped PSG dominate domestically, winning Ligue 1 titles and domestic cups again and again. In 2020, he even helped drag PSG to their first ever Champions League final, which they lost narrowly to Bayern Munich. It was close, painfully close, to being the crowning achievement of his club career. It never quite arrived. Off the pitch, Neymar's personal life was constantly under a microscope, the way it tends to be for athletes at that level of fame. He became a father for the first time in 2011, to his son Davi Luca, with his then-partner Carolina Dantas, becoming a father himself before he'd even fully become a global star. Years later, he welcomed a daughter, Mavi, with Bruna Biancardi. His relationships, his nights out, his social media posts, all of it became tabloid fodder in Brazil and beyond, often overshadowing the football itself. And then there were the harder controversies. In 2019, Neymar was accused of rape by a woman in Paris. He publicly and vehemently denied the allegations, releasing private messages between himself and the accuser as part of his defense. Brazilian prosecutors ultimately decided not to press charges, citing insufficient evidence, and the case was closed without a conviction. It remains to this day one of the most serious and scrutinized moments of his public life. A reminder that fame this large comes with scrutiny that never fully goes away, whatever the outcome. Through all of it, the scandals, the injuries, the tabloid noise, Neymar kept returning to the one place that made sense to him, the pitch, and the Brazilian national team. At the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, Neymar, by then 30 years old and playing in what many assumed would be his final World Cup, delivered moments of vintage brilliance, including a stunning goal against Croatia in the quarterfinal. That goal tied him with Pelé's all-time Brazil scoring record in that very match. But heartbreak struck again. Brazil lost on penalties to Croatia, eliminated earlier than anyone in the country expected. Neymar was seen in tears once more, this time on the turf in Qatar, the World Cup trophy slipping away from him yet again. He would later surpass Pelé's international scoring record entirely in 2023, becoming Brazil's all-time leading goalscorer, a number that for decades seemed untouchable, attached forever to the name of the man whose club he'd started at as a boy. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The kid who grew up idolizing Pelé, who played on Pelé's old pitch at Santos, who was compared to him before he'd even played a professional match, ends up wearing the crown himself. But 2023 also brought one of the cruelest blows of his career. Playing for Brazil in a World Cup qualifier, Neymar suffered a torn ACL and meniscus in his left knee, a devastating injury that ruled him out for the better part of a year and raised real questions, for the first time, about whether his body could still keep up with his ambition. Later, Neymar signed with Al Hilal in Saudi Arabia, part of a wave of global superstars chasing new chapters and new paydays in the Saudi Pro League, before eventually finding his way back home, returning to the club where it all started, Santos. A boy who left as a teenager came back as a legend, closing a circle that began in that youth academy decades earlier. Now here's something most fans never hear about, the side of Neymar that doesn't make the highlight reels. Away from the cameras, he runs the Instituto Projeto Neymar Jr., a foundation he and his family started back in 2003, long before he was famous, aimed at giving underprivileged children in Brazil access to education, sports, and opportunity. The very things that were never guaranteed for a boy growing up next to a gas station. It's personal for him in a way that a highlight reel could never capture. He's also known, almost comically, as one of the best amateur poker players among professional athletes, having competed in actual televised poker tournaments. And before the fame, before the money, he used to skateboard through the streets of São Vicente, which, if you think about it, explains a lot about that fearless, improvisational style he'd later bring to a football pitch. So what do we actually make of Neymar? Is he the tragic story of unmet potential, a generational talent whose body and off-field chaos kept him from becoming the undisputed best player of his generation? Or is he something else entirely? Proof that greatness doesn't have to look like a straight, clean, uncomplicated line. Because here's the truth. Neymar won trophies at every single club he played for. He won an Olympic gold medal for a country that had never had one. He broke Pelé's international goal-scoring record, a record most people thought was permanently untouchable. He became, and to this day remains, the single most expensive transfer in the history of football, a number that some analysts believe may never be broken again, given how the market has shifted. Whatever the criticisms, whatever the controversies, the numbers on the pitch don't lie. But maybe the most important part of his story isn't the trophies or the transfer fees at all. Maybe it's the boy in the back of that van, sleeping next to gas pumps, carried by a father who believed in him before the world had any reason to. Maybe it's the fact that every time life knocked him down, a broken back on home soil, a torn ACL, a scandal, a heartbreak in front of millions, he got back up and found his way back to a football pitch, because that ball at his feet was never just a job. It was survival. It was identity. It was home. Neymar's story isn't finished. Legacies rarely are while the person is still writing them. But one thing is already certain. Whatever happens next, a kid from a small city outside São Paulo, with almost nothing, became worth more than any footballer in history, not because of the price tag Paris Saint-Germain once paid, but because of every single struggle that came before it made that price tag possible. If this story moved you even a little, don't just scroll past it. Hit that like button, subscribe if you want more real, honest sports documentaries like this one, and drop a comment telling me what part of Neymar's journey hit you the hardest. Because stories like this deserve to be remembered, not just for the goals, but for everything it took to score them.